Unless I see the marks of the nails on his hand, unless I can touch his side where he was pierced, I will not believe. Perhaps you recognize those words from the Apostle Thomas when he was first told that Jesus is alive. There's a story told to us in the Gospel of John, chapter 20. The story begins on Easter Sunday. It was around evening time. All of the apostles were gathered together in one place. Well, not all of them. Judas wasn't there. He'd gone out and hanged himself. And for some reason, Thomas was not with the other apostles when Jesus appeared to them. Now, we don't know why he was missing, but this is a passage that we preachers like to use sometime to tell our congregation, don't you dare skip out on a gathering of God's people. You might miss out on something good. Now, I'm not sure if that's a fair use of this text, but it is good advice that when God's people come together, something good is bound to happen. You don't want to miss out on that. Well, this gathering of the apostles was an opportunity for them to see something good, a resurrection appearance of Jesus Christ. Now, they will later tell Thomas the story, and Thomas does not believe. Even though it's coming from the mouth of apostles, he still will not believe that the Lord has shown himself alive. Now, Thomas says, I've got to be convinced. I need some evidence. I need proof. He wants to see it. He wants to reach out and touch. Probably Thomas is thinking along these lines. You may have seen somebody, but I want to confirm that the somebody you saw is the somebody we once knew. Jesus of Nazareth, our teacher, our Lord. I want to make sure they're the same. I want to see that. And he wants to make sure the person they saw has the marks of the cross, the crucifixion with his hands, his feet, and his side. He says, I'm going to have to see. I'm going to have to take my finger and place my finger in the scars. I'm going to have to put my hand into his side. Now, it's these doubts that are expressed by Thomas that have led to the expression, a doubting Thomas. Anyone who's told something, and it's a bit incredible, and they say, oh, I can't believe that. I'll have to see it with my own eyes. You're going to have to prove it to me. We call that person a doubting Thomas. Now, the story continues a week later. We're told in the text it was 8 days later. Remember, they like to count inclusive, the day you're on and the day you're headed towards, and from Sunday to Sunday, 8 days. So 8 days later, the next Sunday, and Jesus made another appearance to the apostles, second time now. And this time Thomas was there, along with the others. And on this occasion, Jesus took the words of Thomas and turned them back. Said, okay, come forward and reach out your finger and touch my hands. Reach out your hand and put it at my side. No more doubting now, Thomas. I want you to believe. Now, we always wonder, what did Thomas do? Did he reach out and touch? Could be he was just frozen stiff. He was scared to death that he had challenged the idea now Jesus is standing before him. Or maybe he did reach out and touch. After all, he said, that's what I'll have to do if I'm to believe. And when you look at some of the great portraits in art throughout history of this scene, they always portray Thomas, and he's reaching out and he's touching, and he is being satisfied by the evidence that Jesus is alive. Now, on this occasion, when Thomas saw and was able to touch, he stated a confession of faith. He said to Jesus, my Lord and my God. Now, you say what you will about Thomas. You can call him the doubting Thomas. But this confession of faith was wonderful. It's the first confession of faith on record ever since the death and resurrection of Jesus. So he's a first for us. Not only that, he affirmed the lordship of Christ, and he affirmed the deity of Christ. My Lord and my God. It doesn't get any better than that confession of faith. Now, this may raise a question for us, though. Why was Thomas so hard to convince about the resurrection of Jesus? Why is it he couldn't trust the report of others, especially when those reports came from his fellow apostles? Why was Thomas a doubting Thomas? Well, even as you're thinking about Thomas, let me mention this to you, that Thomas wasn't the only doubting Thomas. The truth is that every one of the disciples doubted until they didn't doubt any longer. You see, in the beginning, they were all doubting Thomases. We're told that by Mark in chapter 16. Mark says that Mary Magdalene went back and she reported to those who had been with Jesus. Now it's going to be the apostles plus all the other disciples, those who had been with Jesus. And when she reported to them, as they're mourning and weeping over Jesus, they heard from her that Jesus was alive, that he had been seen by her, and they refused to believe it. All of the disciples were doubting Thomases in the very beginning. Now that includes the apostles in particular. When Luke tells the story in Luke chapter 24, Luke says the women, they came back from the tomb, they reported everything to the apostles and then to all the rest. That's the apostles plus the other disciples. And yet we're told that they heard the words of the women, but the words sounded like nonsense, and they would not believe what the women said. You see, everyone had a bad case of, I don't believe it. I doubt that could be true. I'm going to have to see it before I can believe it. It wasn't just Thomas who was a doubting Thomas. Now, the first appearance to the apostles, minus Thomas, on that Easter Sunday evening, Jesus showed up. And he turned to the apostles, and it says he showed them his hands. He showed them his side. You see, what Thomas asked for is what the early apostles also had to see before they could believe. Luke says that when Jesus first appeared to them, they were so afraid they thought they were seeing a ghost. Some translation will say a spirit. They didn't think it was real, or at least not really Jesus in the flesh. And when Jesus spoke to them, he said, why are you so troubled? In other words, why are you so upset and afraid? And why is there doubt in your hearts? Yeah, the doubt didn't begin with Thomas. The doubt was with all of them. And then Jesus offered to them the very thing that Thomas said, I want as well. And that is, Jesus said, come forward, look at my hands, look at my feet, affirm that it is me, I myself. Touch me and see for yourself. You see, there were a whole lot of doubting Thomases going around, not just the Apostle Thomas. Now, what Jesus did for all of them was give them a gentle rebuke that it took them so long to finally come to believe. We're told in Mark 16 that Jesus reproached. He rebuked his disciples for their unbelief, for their hardness of heart. Because after all, they had not believed even those who had seen and testified to what they'd seen. You see, they had witnesses, and they didn't believe the witnesses. Here's the irony of our great witnesses of the resurrection. Those who became witnesses were first doubters, eventually won over to become witnesses. Now, while that may seem sad and tragic, actually, that works out pretty good for us in the end. Because since they demanded good evidence for the resurrection claim, it's really great that the Lord provided that evidence to them. And thus, as they now make the witness to us, then they report what they saw. They not only tell us what they saw, but they give us the evidence that the Lord gave them. They give us the proofs that he demonstrated to the disciples. You see, all they really wanted, whether it be Thomas or the rest of the disciples, they wanted empirical evidence. Empirical means something the five senses can get a handle on, that I can touch, that I can see, that I can hear, smell, and taste. I want some empirical evidence. They wanted objective evidence versus subjective feelings. I feel like he's alive. They wanted better than that. They want something that's real and concrete. Really, if you think about it, what they wanted was scientific evidence. Because you know how science operates. If something is true, it shouldn't happen just one single time. It ought to be something that can be repeated, that you get multiple opportunities to see it and see it working the same way. And so Jesus made multiple appearances, and on each of those appearances gave people the opportunity to see, to reach out and touch, to confirm that he was alive. It was repeated. It was verifiable. You can go to the people and ask them what they saw. Let them tell their story. You could go to the tomb and find it empty. And the evidence that Jesus gave was sensible. That is, not only could the five senses get a hold of it, but to your mind, as that connection between senses and mind takes effect, it started to make sense. Jesus was truly alive. Those early witnesses moved from doubt to faith to witnesses. That was the progression for all of them. I don't believe it. Now I do believe it. Now let me tell somebody what I have seen. that Jesus is alive. You see, it's because of the stories of the doubting Thomases that you and I have good reason to join them in the faith they came to. You see, by doubting and demanding evidence, they eventually became strong witnesses of the resurrection of Jesus. And thus you and I have good reasons to believe, thanks to the doubts of the first witnesses.